First of all, I got to tell you, this isn't an anti-tenant video. It's not to be pro-landlord. It's not to be pro-tenant. It's not really to serve anybody other than introduce the idea to landlords who are maybe thinking about getting into the rental game, or they are in the rental game and maybe not loving what's going on. This is a video to let you know, the landlord, about the very real problems and challenges of being a landlord in British Columbia in 2026. Now, landlords and tenants, they both need each other. They've got an interesting relationship, and it seems like a really fun game where tenants hate on landlords and the fact that they've got these rental units, and landlords have this impression that maybe tenants don't take care of their homes, don't respect the fact that they've given them a place to live. Here's the reality of what's going on right now in the rental market in British Columbia. A lot of investors are simply fleeing the market. They're getting rid of their rental properties because of a lot of changes that have happened with the Residential Tenancy Act over the last few years, really over about the last 7 years, but there were some fairly significant ones that came into force in 2024. The goal of this video is to make you aware of all of these changes and just educate some of the landlords out there, or educate some of the people thinking about becoming a landlord, about the really real challenges that exist out there. And the fact that so many people don't know these is concerning, because they get into these situations, they're not aware of them, and they see investing in real estate in British Columbia as this financial windfall where it's a no-lose situation, and they get into these rental situations, but they just really don't understand the rights of the tenant and the responsibilities of the landlord, which are absolutely crucial to not only having a successful relationship, but also having a successful investment in the property. You know, it's interesting because it's estimated in the 2021 census that over 600,000 rental households, 660,000 in fact, existed in British Columbia, and 40% of those in Metro Vancouver are what are considered mom and pop operations. So they're not owned by corporations, they're not owned by government, and that's a really, really large portion of that. So where the problem becomes is some of these things I'm about to share with you. A lot of these mom and pop investors are actually getting out, and I'm getting these phone calls ultra frequently because they just don't want to have to succumb to the rules of the game that have changed significantly maybe since they originally got into the market. So we're going to dive into all of these reasons today, and if that sounds good, I can guarantee you're going to learn some stuff that you didn't know. So hang around to the end and we'll get to it all. You only get one chance to buy or sell your next home. Let's get it right. Hey, worth mentioning, my name is Darren, a real estate professional serving the Surrey, South Surrey, White Rock, and surrounding municipality areas. I have been selling real estate since 2007 and have helped hundreds and hundreds of families either buy or sell in the area. And in fact, we meet many of the people that we help on this very YouTube channel. So if you're looking for the right advice to get information for your own specific situation and be set on a path so you can be successful and avoid all the pitfalls, be sure to book a time to speak with me or a team member in the description below of this video. Okay, so let's unpack some of these issues, and I've really kind of put them into 3 different buckets for you. So you can check the chapters below and jump to whatever bucket might interest you, but all the buckets are full of things that you really need to understand when you decide to become a landlord, because these are real challenges that are hurting real people, causing them to get out of the market. So the first one is really financial challenges. Owning a rental is rarely profitable now, especially, you know, unless you've owned it for quite some time. The next one is legal and policy burdens, and the last one is tenant accountability challenges. So let's kind of unpack these one by one. And I've got some notes here that I got ready for this video, so I'm just going to go through these. So if I'm looking down, I apologize, but I want to make sure I don't miss anything because there's so much here to unpack. So one of the big challenges in the first bucket, financial challenges with owning a rental property no longer being profitable now, is that oftentimes, especially nowadays, the rent does not often cover the ownership costs of a property. So I want you to consider the costs that go into owning a rental property. You know, you've got a mortgage likely, you've got taxes, things like property taxes. You might have strata fees, which can also include things like special levies and whatnot. You've got insurance on the property. You've got repairs to that rental property. You've got utilities that you might have to pay to the city, like in the city of Surrey, as an example. And you've also got property management fees. So right away, there's all these things that are kind of stacked and make it challenging to actually have a profit. And one of the only ways to actually have a profit as a landlord is to put down a significant down payment. We're not talking about just simply 20%, especially in an area like the Lower Mainland where property values are generally quite high. You need to put down a really big number to have monthly cash flow. In fact, a lot of people get into the rental game kind of looking at it as an equity play, thinking the prices are going to go up over time rather than a cash flow play. Now, keeping into the financial challenges bucket, I want to bring to your attention as well that 1 month rent is owed to the tenant when the tenancy is ended by the landlord. We're going to talk a lot about tenancies getting ended by the landlord because that's really, really important. So there's a little bit of cash right there, but there's also the damage deposit. So if a tenant was to damage a property, I want you to think about how expensive things are, generally speaking, right now. Let's imagine, for instance, you had to replace a carpet. Well, what would the cost of a carpet be in a living room, as an example? A reasonable sized living room in a 2-bedroom condominium. Well, I can almost guess with certainty that it is going to be significantly more than only half a month of rent. Half a month of rent doesn't go very far. So if the average rent, as an example, was, let's say, $2,600 for a 2-bedroom condominium, that's $1,300. That's not even going to cover the cost of a carpet. So if you had damage to a unit, the chances of you recovering those damages through the damage deposit is already incredibly challenging. There's also other problems with this damage deposit because when you go do your walkthrough, the Residential Tenancy Board has a really high standard that they put on the landlord. In fact, this is an overarching theme, is the Tenancy Board really treats landlords like business owners who are expected to know the rules and follow them inside out and to do everything absolutely properly. They hold them to a very high standard, and maybe that's not necessarily a problem, but that same kind of level of standard isn't necessarily true for the tenants, and something we'll maybe get into a little bit later, but they're certainly not held to the same level of standard. It's looked as a business arrangement or a business deal through the eyes of the landlord, but the tenants are certainly much more protected and have a higher level of protection and a higher level of being able to maybe get away with things when things go wrong. It's not to say that there's not mechanisms to try and hold them accountable. There certainly is, but getting them to be accountable is a whole other challenge. But anyways, to continue on with the damage deposit. So if you miss returning that damage deposit within a 15-day window or fail to complete forms properly, like a condition inspection report, when you originally rent out the unit, there is no claiming that damage deposit. You don't have a right as a landlord to actually claim damage because you didn't do the work properly either at the end of the tenancy or at the very beginning. Another financial challenge is, and this is one of the biggest ones, this was not necessarily a new thing, but a rental cap. So if you're somebody from outside of British Columbia or you're unfamiliar, there's rent caps set every year by the government on what you are allowed to do in terms of raising the rent for your tenant. Those do not keep up with inflation at all. Over 10 years, since 2015, inflation is up nearly 30%, but rents have only been allowed to increase over those 10 years by 28.2%. So there's been variances, year over year about whether it did keep up with inflation or not, but generally speaking, over 10 years, you are still below the actual rate of inflation. And we're not necessarily even taking into account mortgages or anything like that. And what's happened with those, you sign a 5-year mortgage, well, it may go like this over the course of 10 years, right? Things can certainly change. In 2025, the rent cap, the availability of raising the rent was 3%. And in 2026, it's projected to be 2.3%. But here's the thing. You can't catch up on missed rent payments. So if you've been a landlord where you, missed rent payments, but more so increases. So if you've been a landlord that maybe hasn't been paying attention, or you really like your tenant for whatever reason and you haven't been raising the rent, which is fine. That's great. That's up to you. You can't catch up on those increases. So you can't make up for lost time, so to speak. You can only raise the rent by the provincially set cap each year. You don't get to catch up from the previous years. And here's an interesting thing is like tenants, they can leave your rental unit if they find a better deal. So the, fictitious 2-bedroom condo that they're renting, if they feel that they're paying too much, they can certainly try and renegotiate. You as a landlord don't necessarily have to agree to that. But what they can do is they can, opt out and go rent something else, right? They can go move on to another property. But you as a landlord, you don't get that luxury when the market is cooperating in your favor. So if rental prices are going down, of course, the tenant gets that benefit. But you as a landlord, you can't raise the rent to react to what the market is doing. So it's kind of taking out like free market principles here. If rent is in high demand, you just simply have to adhere to what those rental caps are. You're not going to let the rent or the market rather kind of take control of what the real rent should be. So it's not a free market system out here. This means things like strata fees or insurance and levies that keep rising. Things keep getting more expensive, but rents don't necessarily match that. Not only that, like in this financial challenges kind of bucket, we also have to acknowledge that when you go to sell a property that you invested in, there's costs associated with that. And there's actually costs associated with that when you're buying it as well. So I want you to think of like real estate fees. A typical real estate fee on a $600,000 condominium could be anywhere around $20,000, give or take. It could be, there's tons of different business models out there and you pick what's best for you, but that's a fairly common number that you might see out there. You've got legal fees as an example. You've got tax on the capital gains or any profits that you might make on the unit. Or the rental property. So, to put that in perspective a little bit, if you're earning, or your household is earning anywhere above kind of the general average for the BC household, which is about $107,000 per year. But if your family or you are earning over $115,000 a year on any profits you make on that sale, you can expect a combined tax rate between federal and provincial of at least 38% or more on any of your capital gains. All of this to be said, you need massive appreciation in the value of that unit to start making money, if that's really the reason that you got into it. And most landlords are in it to make a profit. They're not in it to provide housing out of the goodness of their hearts. Of course, they want the best for these people. Why wouldn't they? But there's lots of other investments to make money that are maybe a little bit safer. Jumping on to the next bucket, we've got legal and policy burdens. And there's just incredible risk and red tape involved in this bucket. So as I said, BC really sees these landlords as business owners who must understand the rules to the letter, but the tenants are not necessarily held to the same standard. The tenants, which is a big voting demographic, a big voting block for the government, and they deserve rights and they deserve to be protected. It's just when the scales start to tip maybe a little unfairly from where we might have been more balanced in the past to giving a lot more favorability to the tenants, generally speaking. So for a landlord, as an example, any policy mistakes, any mistakes they do onboarding a tenant, removing a tenant, anything like that, landlords can get penalized, and they can get penalized heavily. One of the challenges I think we have in BC is our government, for the last few years anyway, has really ran what I call this almost like Elon Musk model of announcing rule changes. And this isn't just limited to landlords and tenants or the Residential Tenancy Act, but a lot of other things, which is not for the purpose of this video. But what they kind of do is when they're making policy, they kind of announce this big idea, this big announcement. It's very clickbaity. It's very headline worthy. It's very rah, rah, rah. The social media crowd's going to love it, but there's not a lot of clear detail behind the plan. I call it the Elon Musk model because it's like, here's this cool car that, you can buy 4 years from now, that we may or may not release right away. But here's all the incredible features about it. And, it doesn't exist yet, but we'll figure all that out as we go down the road. So you tend to see a lot of that in British Columbia. And there's been some changes that have come out of this in the last few years that are really, really worth knowing. So I'm going to give you a few of those now. And some of these would probably make or break, and more likely break, your intention of becoming a landlord or remaining as a landlord. So one of them is tenancies effectively are now indefinite. What do I mean by that? Well, you just can't end a tenancy at the end of a fixed term or a lease. And this is something that so many landlords don't understand. They just don't get it. They don't know this exists. But when you have a fixed term lease, that lease continues on a month-to-month basis at the tenant's discretion, not the landlord's. The landlord could not end it. They cannot remove the tenant. And sorry, that's not completely absolutely true. They can remove the tenant under certain circumstances, but those circumstances are really around two kind of major, I don't want to use the word buckets because I've been using that a lot in this video, but two major ideas. One is that they're selling the property or owner occupying it. That's kind of the same thing. Someone is actually moving in that wants to live there. That's the owner of the property, or it is a significant renovation. So significant that the tenant couldn't actually live there. Those are really the only reasons that you can remove a tenant, other than them breaching rules of the Residential Tenancy Act or the tenancy agreement. Of course, they're still removing tenants for the purpose of cause. But with all that said, hear me on this. Fixed term tenancies, leases, whatever you want to call them, they do not end on the date that you write on that tenancy agreement anymore. And this even applies to tenancy agreements and tenants that have been in properties for absolutely forever, because the new rules override whatever you wrote on those original agreements. So that means putting a tenant into a property for a year, that tenant could effectively be there indefinitely unless you have a way of removing them and triggering their necessity to actually vacate the unit. Another thing that's changed, and not that I disagree with this, but worth knowing, is landlords cannot forbid or penalize tenants for family growth. So as an example, you've got maybe a 1-bedroom unit and a nice couple moves in, and fast forward over time, they have a family. Well, that 1-bedroom unit, the wear and tear on that for you as a landlord might be incredible. And that doesn't mean that, maybe there's more than one child. And I don't want to suggest that having a family is a bad thing, but from a landlord perspective, a 1-bedroom might not be sufficient, or you may not want it to be sufficient for all of that wear and tear, all of that traffic, all of the people living in there, using the utilities, using the property, etc. Right? There's lots of things to unpack there. So this is a big change that came in 2024. Another one that I want to bring to your attention is rent. It can only be increased every 12 months with a 3-month notice period. So we talked a little bit about rental increases previously, but you have a 12-month kind of rotating shot clock to be able to increase rent by that provincially set cap rate. And you have to give 3 months notice that this is happening. So again, if you waited 13 months, well, that's your fault as a landlord. That's not the tenant's fault. And you have to give that 3-month notice to be able to trigger that. Another one is if you are moving into the property or you sell the property to somebody that wants to occupy it. And that's a really big one. I want to unpack this a little bit, but when you do that, the person buying the unit or you as the landlord actually have to occupy that unit for 12 months. And failing to do that can actually trigger up to a 12-month rent penalty due from the landlord or the new owner to the tenant. So when you sell a property, the buyer is expected to either assume the tenancy. The tenancy runs with the property, means it's almost like me selling my pair of shoes. The owner of the shoe doesn't matter. It's the shoe itself that's important. So the land or the new owner either assumes the tenancy or they are moving in for personal purposes, but they have to occupy that unit for at least 12 months, or they could face a penalty of up to 12 months of rent as a penalty to the tenant for removing them. And that's on top of them actually having to give that 1-month penalty for even removing them, right? Regardless of who has to pay that. So that's up to 12 months from 6 months. The other thing that is worth noting about that is tenants, well, they now get 30 days to dispute eviction notices. That's up from 13. I'm going to unpack that a little bit more in a moment here. You as a landlord, if you're moving into the unit, you have to give the tenant at least 4 months of notice if you're using it for personal use, and you have to give 3 months notice if it's for a new buyer. So I want to touch on that new buyer or somebody buying the property for themselves, you trying to sell that rental unit in the future, which is obviously something you're going to have to do at some point, because some of these are incredibly detrimental to you as a landlord and somebody who's trying to use this vehicle as an investment. So I want you to consider putting a unit on the market right now that is tenant occupied, and the fact that the buyer has to assume a lot of risk because they don't know that necessarily the tenant is going to vacate. They could actually assume that unit when they complete on it with the tenant in it. They could assume it with damages to the unit they don't necessarily know. So there's already a risk for the buyer ever buying a tenant occupied property. But here's where it gets a little more challenging for a landlord or a person selling. The tenant is entitled now up from 2 months, but they're actually entitled to 3 months of notice before somebody can occupy, and a full 3 months of notice. So as an example, if the notice was given on the second day of the month. That whole month is what we call a burn month, and the 3 full months will be 3 calendar months starting after that. So that means it could take nearly 4 months for that buyer to actually even be able to occupy the property, along with all the risks that they associate when there's a tenant in there, but take them at least 4 months to even be able to get in there, but at least a minimum of 3. Now, here's the problem with that. When you're competing with other places on the market that don't have tenants, maybe they're owner occupied, the owner has a higher level of responsibility in how they not only have to deliver that property, they're going to get out of that property. There's no risk of necessarily assuming a tenant there, but they also don't have to wait over 3 months to get into that. I mean, most people are buying a home because they want to get into it. So if you're a buyer and you're going to assume all this risk and you have to wait all this time to occupy a property, you're going to have some expectations on that property that you're going to get it at a heck of a price. Like, you're going to want to get it at a discounted price because you're taking on risk, and you're also going to have incredible flexibility. This generally just removes the intent and the want by a lot of buyers out there to actually even want to buy tenant occupied properties because of the risk and because of the waiting. So naturally, as a seller, a landlord, you are already at a massive disadvantage when you want to go ahead and sell your property. So these are all really big problems. And I touched on too, like that 30 days notice for a tenants have rather 30 days to dispute the fact that they want to to dispute the claim that they have to vacate the unit. Well, that's also another 30 days that can sit in limbo. Like, it's a massive issue and a massive problem that landlords are dealing with. Hence, one of the many reasons why in 2025, landlords are absolutely fleeing the rental market. They don't want to put up with some of these things that have been put in place because it is so detrimental. In fact, as a real estate professional, the phone calls that I get again and again and again are simply the fact that my tenant has decided to leave. Maybe they found a better deal, which is great for the tenant. However, I don't want to re-rent out my unit because of some of these rental rules. I want to get it on the market and I want to sell it because I do not want to have to succumb to all these new rules and all these new challenges and all these new problems. I recognize how difficult they are and how hard they are to overcome, and they also affect my profitability. So what happens with that? Well, that causes at least one rental unit to be removed from the rental stock, meaning tenants have less to choose from, and it just creates this terrible environment because now you have less rental properties on the market. Are we wanting to rely on government only for rentals, purpose-built rentals? Is that what we want as a society, or do we want these mom and pop investors to be able to offer these accommodations to these people? And, if you're a tenant watching this, let's try not to vilify landlords whatsoever. This is people that are offering opportunities to, live, work, play in the community that you choose, and they've got a home that they're offering you to take over as though it was your own. And naturally, as you would expect, they're not doing that necessarily out of the goodness of their heart. They do expect a profit, and they also do expect that the home is well taken care of and you respect their home and they're treated fairly. So you can see where some of these problems are for landlords to get into this. So that kind of concludes bucket number 2. The last bucket that I'm going to touch on is tenant accountability challenges. And this is a challenge with the act and everything. The rules that are all in it. As an example, if the tenant stops paying rent, it can take months to evict them as a landlord. That's a really big challenge that landlords have. It can also cost a ton of money. As an example, you can't just open the door and start throwing their stuff on the street after a couple weeks of missed rent payments. You have to go through the Residential Tenancy Board. You might even have to go to an arbitration. You might even have to go to the point of hiring a bailiff to go in and remove all of their stuff. And this can take months and months and months and cost a ton of money. But one of the bigger issues that's always kind of been looming about tenancies is there's really no accountability for bad tenants. And truth be told, there's no accountability for bad landlords either. This is an issue that could be solved quite easily on both sides of the fence. Since this video is for landlords, though, I'm going to reference this about, challenging tenants that maybe don't pay rent, tenants that really beat up the place. There's no central pool where a landlord can even upload factual evidence that, maybe a tenant has been brought before the tenancy board for arbitration, or they've been removed because they didn't pay their rent and it's gone through the tenancy board. This has all been approved. There's no real good way for a landlord to source out information for a tenant because the government refuses to go down that road. And so what you're relying on as a landlord is their willingness to give you credit information. You're calling their references. And I mean, let's be real. I mean, they're giving you, anybody giving you references is giving people who are going to sing their praises rather than people who are going to tell you, what's really going on. And again, most tenants, almost all tenants aren't bad people, but just like anything, there are bad people who look to take advantage of the situation out there. So how do you protect yourself as a landlord? And there's no real good tool to do that. There's the accountability is just really, really challenging. And then of course the process for claiming damages or rent owed is complex, it's slow, and it's not often worth pursuing. I've gone through this myself with a tenanted property where the tenant had to be removed for non-payment of rent. And by the time I kept on filing paperwork and going to these provincial organizations and how to get the money back that I was owed, it just wasn't worth it. The peace of mind was more important than the headache, and getting charged $75 or $100 every time I needed to file a piece of paper that eventually was going to eat up all the money I was owed anyway. So I just decided to leave it. And that's what a lot of landlords do. It's just not worth the headache. So we've covered the 3 buckets. And if nothing more, I really hope this was an eye-opening video for anybody that's been considering either becoming a landlord, or if you are a landlord in the province of British Columbia, you kind of heed these warnings and really take into consideration of anything that I've said today, and see if that's a deal breaker for you before you decide to either continue on or get into the rental game. The government says that these changes support renters, but the question is, are they really helping? As I identified, rental stock is being removed at a much higher rate than it has been in the past because landlords are just fed up. They don't want to be a part of it. They see better investments in other areas with way less headaches and way less risk. So that is a result of putting too many rules in place that are lopsided for people. And ideally, maybe some stuff starts getting into place to help support landlords. An example of that could certainly be, if it's so regulated by the province, then why isn't there a provincial insurance for landlords when things are done correctly and they come to find their unit really beat up or they're out money because they can't get the tenant out because of the rules set by the government? Why is there not maybe insurance in place to help those people? Ideas like that. That said, I would love to hear any ideas that you might have to level the playing field for both sides, whether you're a tenant or a landlord. I'd love you to leave those in the comments and just let people know your great ideas. And also, if there's things in this video you agreed with, or things in this video that I missed, or things in this video that you disagree with, leave them in the comments and let people know. And this at least will, if nothing more, help educate the people that are watching this that are interested in maybe becoming a landlord. So my last question for you is, would you, knowing what you know after watching this video, rent a property, become a landlord, buy a property in British Columbia to rent it out, provide rental stock to tenants that need it in British Columbia, knowing what you know now? Leave a comment below in this video, and don't forget to subscribe because we release videos all about the crazy world and changes and regulations in British Columbia real estate all the time, as well as lots of local information for the areas we serve of Surrey, White Rock, and the surrounding municipalities. So we'll look forward to seeing you on the next videos. Thanks for watching.